am back on this Saturday evening, much later than planned. I didn't forget, really, I didn't forget, but I don't want to break the streak, as we might call it now, of reading for over 30 days, coming up for 40 days soon. Let's read chapters 8 and 9 of The Kraken's Curse, shall we? Call it a bedtime story. Chapter 8, The Article. The sun rose brightly, lighting all that was around. Arthur felt happy as he left his little cottage on the cliff top, and he knew that today would be a day to succeed. It was a quiet day, and the air was soft and subtle. Arthur had left early, and so the village shop had... Arthur had left early, so that he was at the village shop with plenty of time to meet Beatrice. As it was so early, a lot of the villagers were still tucked up in their beds. A few, however, had ventured out and muttered odd words in greeting. Upon his arrival at the shop, Arthur was surprised to find Beatrice ready and waiting for him. She was dressed up in a long woolen overcoat, and a purple, flowery hat was on her head. "Beatrice," Arthur smiled as he approached her. "You are an early bird." "I like to be prompt," Beatrice said, half awake and half not. "Shall we get going?" Arthur smiled once again and took Beatrice by the arm. Slowly they walked down the street towards the field where Horace had built his cottage. Arthur had already warned him of their early arrival, so no doubt he would have the kettle on. Horace greeted them with a wide smile and his usual explosive personality. "Arthur," he gabbled, "how nice it is to see you again. Of course, this time I was warned of your arrival, but again so soon. And you have brought a friend." He smiled politely at Beatrice and beckoned both of them inside. The cottage was just as Arthur remembered it. The bird cage was again in the corner of the room, and the kettle was singing away. The coloured drapes were hanging from the window, and the only change that could be noticed was that Horace had placed an extra chair so that Beatrice could have somewhere to sit. "Now tell me," Horace began, while dishing out various cups of tea and chocolate biscuits, "why have you called upon me so early in the morning? But it must be important." "I have reason to believe," Arthur replied, declining the offer of a chocolate Danish, "that Beatrice has some very important information about my father, and I also believe there is something you are not telling me." "Ah, Arthur," Horace smiled. "You are so stuck in your ways, always determined to discover the truth and never open to any means of communication." Arthur did not know what was meant by the last remark, but he dismissed it as if it were not important. "I would of course be very interested to know what Beatrice here has to say." He looked directly in Beatrice's direction, and she gave a little cough to clear her throat before speaking. "I was a dear friend of George Boston," she began, "ever since the day that he fell off his bike in front of my house. I have been giving him advice, and he has done likewise for me." Arthur waited for Horace's reaction, but it didn't come. Instead, Beatrice reached for her shoulder bag and removed an aging newspaper from within. "You see," she spoke again, "Arthur tells me that I am mentioned quite regularly in his father's diary, and—" She pointed at the front page of the newspaper before carrying on. "I was the last person who saw George before he disappeared." What Beatrice was saying seemed to be greatly interesting to Horace, for he was listening intently, and when Beatrice had finished, the reaction Arthur had waited for finally came. "If you would let me have a look at that newspaper," Horace began, before Beatrice handed it over. He flicked through the pages until he found what he was looking for. The front page of the newspaper had the headline, "6 months since mysterious disappearance." But Horace was not interested in this. He had flicked to a page halfway through the newspaper and pointed out an article in bold lettering under the Fisherman's Weekly column. "Arthur," Horace smiled in the direction once more, "I think I may have discovered the one thing that you believe I am not telling you." Without thinking, Arthur snatched the paper from Horace and read the article to himself. "Aging sea captain linked to mysterious disappearance and murder" was the headline, and this said enough in itself, but Arthur read on eagerly. "Today, the elderly Captain Jonathan McCrae was accused of the murder of Alexander Jennings, a villager who died in Market Street last Thursday night. Jonathan is also accused of playing a part in several other crimes which took place within the past few weeks. The captain was not available for comment at the time of going to print." Arthur couldn't see how any of this had anything to do with his story. The article proved nothing more than that journalists got carried away with themselves, and even if it did fuel the plan he was creating in his mind, he was not sure if he should judge it or not. "I don't see how this can be of any importance to my case," Arthur spoke, sounding confused about the story. "This just seems to describe how Captain McCrae has been accused of murder." "I think," Horace replied, addressing both Beatrice and Arthur without meaning to, that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. Arthur didn't much like the idea of someone else telling him what he should do, but all the same, the idea was growing on him. Horace was a very wise man, and he knew what he was talking about. Arthur himself had already suspected the captain of involvement ever since he met him on that first day in the village. He had seemed dangerous and mysterious, and if he was hiding something, perhaps this article had something to do with it. Arthur decided he should take a chance. "All right," he gave in. "So, you are telling me that if I visit Captain McCrae, I might be able to learn something of great interest?" "I'm telling you that it's worth a shot, and too good an opportunity to miss," Horace smiled, with a strange glint in his eye. "You need to understand, Arthur, that I've been working on the answers for a great deal longer than you have, and I've come to my own conclusions about our friend Captain McCrae." "I see what you mean," Arthur spoke in a reserved tone, "and I am sure that when I visit the captain I will come around to your way of thinking." Arthur felt strong about a second. Inside his head, thoughts were rushing round and around. The captain had to save something. The captain had to have something to do with the mystery, otherwise Horace would not have mentioned it. As soon as they had decided on a plan, Horace had told them there was no time like the present and ushered them to the door. Beatrice had made her way back up towards the next village and her home, while Arthur was now walking down towards the marina on the seashore. The sea had a mysterious blue and green shine, and the boats bobbed up and down like tiny children's toys. There was only one cottage on the edge of the marina, and Arthur knew that this was the place where Captain McCrae resided. It seemed to Arthur that the captain was actually living in quite a nice location. It was bright, and the moment you stepped out of your door you had a magnificent view out across the shimmering horizon as it waved its arm towards the sky. Arthur knew he could not put things off any longer and marched up towards the front door. He knocked 3 times and waited for a reply. Behind the door, Arthur could hear footsteps, and soon the door opened to reveal a stiff face, that of the captain. His face looked older than Arthur remembered it, and he wore anger like a clown wears a smile. "You," he spat at Arthur, "what are you doing on my doorstep? Especially after what you said to me back on the beaches of Poole Harbour." "I have been advised to visit you, sir, on the account that you may be able to tell me a story." Captain McCrae merely laughed. "That's us," he chuckled. "Old sea captains full of tales and stories." His chuckle was menacing, like a madman intent on survival. "I regret what happened on the seashore that day." Arthur spoke without meaning, for it was obvious he was not really sorry. "I would like it very much if we could put all this bad air behind us and start again." Arthur reached into his satchel and removed the paper that Beatrice had given him before he left. Casually he flipped to the page that Horace had read from, and then pointed out the article to the captain. His response was imminent. His response was immediate. "I see," he murmured. "Well, that's different." The captain's mood had changed. He was no longer angry with Arthur for his language on the seashore, but he felt sorry for him. It was as if he had a great burden on his shoulders that might soon be lifted, and quietly he pulled away from Arthur and beckoned him into the house. The captain's sitting room was a tight alcove. It was small but perfectly formed. In one corner was a set of bookshelves, and in the other was a warm armchair. The captain reached for the wooden stool and sat down upon it. Arthur placed himself in the battered old armchair. "I have just made some tea," the captain hinted with a smile, but failed. "If you would like me to tell you my story, then I would advise you get yourself a cup from the kitchen before you sit down." Arthur got up from where he sat and walked into the kitchen. He had not spoken since he entered the house, and he was eager to hear McCrae's story. Quickly, he poured himself a cup of tea and then returned back into the living room. The captain was hunched over on his seat, deep in thought. He sensed Arthur's return and sat up again before speaking. "I'm afraid that you will not like my story. You will surely believe me a suspect, but it must be done, and I have to confess, it's been too long." "I will not make assumptions until I know all the facts," Arthur replied for the first time. "I am very interested in your story. I would like to hear your experiences." "Well, if we must, we must. You make sure to hold that cup of tea close, mind. You will need it. There are some biscuits in the cupboard if you want any. I'll prepare myself for my confession while you make yourself comfy." Arthur couldn't refuse the captain's offer of a sweet, and he had a distinct feeling he would need it, so he went over to the cupboard and brought out a plate laden with biscuits. Upon returning, he placed the plate on the coffee table and sat back in his chair. The captain was hunched over again, but this time he did not sit up. He must have been deep in thought, perhaps hoping that nothing bad would come from what he was about to tell Arthur, or maybe wondering how he would feel after this great burden was lifted from his shoulders. Sitting in his seat once more, the captain reached for a biscuit from a plate, ate it, and then, without gesturing in Arthur's direction, and without any expression on his face, he began his story. 9. The Captain's Tale. It was mid-October and the sea around the harbour had become decidedly choppy and strange for the time of year. I remembered it well. The quayside was filled with a strong sense of salt from the waves that crashed against the darkened railings of the seafront. It wasn't a good day for fishing, anyone could see that. But I had none of my previous stock left, and in order to keep my business afloat, I knew I must tackle the storm and try to haul in a large catch. My boat, the Lizzie B, had been moored just around the corner at Spittal Point. The walk was far and way up the cliffside and across somewhat mountainous terrain, but I knew it would do me good and give me a little time to work out prices for this lucrative storm fish. Once I returned to the vessel, I stopped to work out which way the wind was blowing, and I realised that from where I was standing, the storm was not as rough as it had been back at Paul Harbour. I used this to my advantage and decided to cast off before the waves changed their minds. I boarded my little ship and I took the wheel. The nets had been secured on my previous outing, so I knew there was no way they were going to fail. As I pulled the Lizzie B quickly away from the rocky outcrop, I could see Spittal Point quickly disappearing into the dark sea mist behind me. I was alone in a vast and empty landscape, and that was how I liked it. There was something special about bobbing like a tiny insignificant speck on a vast blue and grey world. After an hour of standing at the helm of my own little world, the waves had stopped crashing and the mist had disappeared. I took the liberty to turn off the engine, venture out of my cabin and look around. I breathed deeply, taking in a lungful of sea air. Around me in every direction was the emptiness and nothingness. I could see for miles, but there was nothing to see. I decided that this was as good a spot as any to lay down my nets and spend some time catching fish. I reached for the handle and turned it, releasing the nets from their position. They fell with a plop into the water and rippled on the surface. I looked at my reflection and longed for companionship. I suppose, knowing what you know about me and from what I have described so far, you might think this rather strange. I might seem a little subtle soul who is content with only his own company, but sometimes companionship is so very far away, and there are many times when the sea can be a cruel mistress. Below the vessel, the fish were darting this way and that, like bees around a hive. The water had a mysterious green shimmer and a sparkle, although the surface was clear. Far below, though, the mist and the murk took over. The blues and greens gave way to greys and blacks. The fish no longer swam and the plants no longer grew, for there was no light this far below the surface. In fact, nothing survived, nothing grew, and nothing moved. Nothing, that is, except for a creature steeped in folklore. A creature of long stories and tall tales. A creature that nobody actually believed existed. My eyes were caught amongst the fish as they foolishly trapped themselves in the net, and as I looked on, I noticed something strange. The ripples that I had created returned, and this time I had not moved the nets. My eyes automatically turned into a hard squint as I stared at the nets, searching for any occurrence, anything that should not be there. It happened so quickly that I did not notice it. An emerald green tentacle curled around the net, in and out of the ropes like a greyhound. It snapped the net, moving it under the boat as a wave of strength bore through it. The power had been enough to snap it in several places, and now the fish were escaping down into the blackness. There was no escaping this monster, though, and as the tentacle weaved its way back into the darkness, I knew that my catch would not last long. I was overwhelmed at what I had just seen. My whole catch had gone in the blink of an eye. It was then that I remembered a book in the cabin drawer. It listed all mysterious sea creatures and their various myths and legends. I had been given it as a Christmas present the previous year, and had so far found no use for it. As I ran towards the cabin door, I knew in the back of my mind that the creature would attack again, and soon. I reached the cabin and pulled each drawer out of the sideboard. I was searching for something that I could not find, and I was leaving a complete mess in my wake. It was definitely here. I was sure of that. I reached the last drawer and was adding to the ever-growing pile of papers when I found it. It was leather-bound, the Book of Mysterious Sea Creatures. It had beautiful inscriptions on the cover in gold and red. Its presence went unnoticed, though, as it was covered in a year's worth of dust. I blew on the cover and sent a plume into the air. I coughed and covered my face. Then I proceeded to open the front cover. I flicked through the pages like lightning, hopelessly searching for any creature that resembled the one that had attacked my catch. Page after page I searched. There were endless creatures of all shapes and sizes, but none that I wanted. And then I found it. Staring back at me was a horrific sight. A horrible image and a deadly word. I had heard people mention this creature, but only on bated breath and in snatched conversations, in whispers from other sailors, tales of death and destruction. My mouth went dry. I could feel my heart beating, and slowly I moved my lips and whispered one word. Kraken. So, there we go. Chapters 8 and 9 of The Kraken's Curse, and I will be back tomorrow night at the earlier time, hopefully of 6 p.m. Yes, indeed of 6 p.m. to read chapters 10 and 11. I really hope that you can join me then.